Hello everyone, in today's video I get the Subaru back up and running, I begin a complete suspension and drivetrain overhaul of the miniature Pontiac Firebird drift car, and I begin preparing the body of the new Firebird model car RC conversion project for paint. I'm starting off by working on the Subaru project, which I've been working on a lot these past few weeks, mainly installing some upgraded suspension components. In the last video, I got everything put back together, however I noticed that the pinion gear was slipping on the motor shaft. So before I was able to drive the car, I needed to tighten up the set screw on the pinion gear so that it would no longer slip. Doing this is quite simple. I started by removing the upper support piece. Once the support piece was out of the way, I removed the screws that hold the motor mount and gear assembly so I could access the underside of the enclosure. From the bottom, I can access the set screw on the pinion gear, which I tighten as well as apply a little bit of fresh grease to the gears. With the pinion gear now tight, I'm ready to reassemble the motor mount and upper support. Before mounting the upper support, I wanted to do a quick test to make sure that everything in the drivetrain was functioning correctly. Everything is functioning as it should, although there is a little bit of undesirable vibration. Unfortunately, the right rear wheel axle broke. Fortunately, I had another one on hand, so this wasn't any major inconvenience. I simply installed the new wheel axle. With everything once again functioning as it should, and all the wheels still attached to the chassis, I finally reinstalled the upper support. I don't remember if I mentioned this in the last video, but these new suspension components give this chassis a little wider track width, giving the car a much better look, since before I thought the wheels were too far inside the wheel wells. I was eager to take this car for a test drive. I started by driving it around indoors, just around my work area. The car was working great, but I crashed it into the leg of a chair like an idiot before I had a chance to start filming or take it outside. Fortunately, despite it being a pretty hard hit, the only thing damaged was the left steering arm mount and the servo. The intercooler also fell off, but both it and the mount are undamaged, and I just have to use a little bit of glue to get it back on. It looks like I'll have to wait just a little longer before finally doing some proper driving, but I guess that's just how it goes sometimes. I've got the 1/24 scale Firebird drift build back on the bench. I was able to take this vehicle for a test drive, which I showed in a previous video, and all in all, I was very pleased with how the car performed. Although there's certainly a lot of room for improvement in terms of handling and drifting, being such a unique and experimental build, I was just happy to see the car functioning as well as it did. As I discussed a bit in the last video, I'm going to be doing a complete suspension and drivetrain overhaul on this car. Although the majority of these new parts may look identical to the previous parts I was using, these feature a lot of subtle but important improvements that should have a dramatic impact on the performance of the car. I'll talk a bit more about the improvements I've made to certain components as I install them. I started with the front struts. As I had mentioned when I installed these before, these struts mounted to the underside of the body are more of just a temporary placeholder. I've got an idea for what I believe will be a much better upper strut mount setup. This new upper strut mount design will require some modifications to the body, and the current upper strut mounts will need to be removed. I've now got a nice flat surface to install the new upper strut mounts. I next begin removing all of the suspension and drivetrain components from the chassis, starting with the rear axle. Now that I'm left with just the bare chassis, I wanted to remove any rough spots from where I cut sections of the model kit's chassis piece in order to make room for the suspension components. I cut a small piece of styrene to patch up a section of the radiator mount. As I mentioned before, the heat from the motor was causing the motor mount piece to bend a bit, so I will be installing a new motor mount. The new rear axle housing I'm using incorporates a place to mount a torque arm, which will eliminate the axle twist. I needed to make some modifications to the chassis in order to make room for the torque arm. With this little bit of trimming and sanding, I should now have ample space for the torque arm. I will ensure this is the case by test fitting everything before I paint the chassis. I made a few minor modifications to the front K-member piece and control arms. The control arms move very smoothly and their travel has been limited. Although all these parts look good as is, I wanted to give them a coat of matte black paint to better match the color of the chassis. Once the paint was dry, I was ready to begin assembling the rear suspension and axle assembly. I started by assembling the trailing arms. I used the old trailing arms as a reference and cut the steel rods to the correct length. After ensuring that each rod was the same length, I glued the trailing arm ends to the rods. I then press fit the socket end of the trailing arms onto the rear axle housing and ensure that they are moving smoothly. I decided to reuse the screws from before to mount the other end of the trailing arm. The new rear axle incorporates several improvements, the biggest being that it's now one solid rod with the ring gear solidly mounted to it, so there's no worries about a differential acting up like before. Also, the hubs are thicker, making them slightly stronger. I first installed the pinion gear, and then placed the axle into the housing, making sure that the gears were well lubricated. I then installed the 8 screws that hold the 2 halves of the axle assembly together, being careful not to strip any of the heads. The axle rotates smoothly as it should. I would have liked to make a little more progress on this build, however this past week flew right by, but I've gotten a solid start on the rebuild of this car. I did spend a lot of time working on improving the design of these components, especially with regards to the tolerance and fitment of the individual parts, which is easier said than done in this scale. These parts have so far been going together better than any of the parts seen previously, and are more representative of the final components that will be made available for sale, and should provide smooth suspension articulation, minimal slop, and be easier to assemble. I'm hoping to be able to make a lot more progress on this project this upcoming week. Of course, as always, I'll keep you updated. So for those who don't know, I bought a second 124 scale Monogram Firebird identical to the one I'm building into a drift car, only this one I bought new. Considering how much time I've spent designing parts that fit this specific kit, I wanted to buy another one and convert it into a functioning RC car, just like I'm doing with the drift build. However, I will be doing something different with this car. I thought about doing something rather crazy and ambitious with this build, however, considering how many other somewhat ambitious projects I have in progress, I decided to keep this build simple. I'm going to be building this car into a stock or lightly modified Firebird Formula, utilizing a lot of the parts included with this kit. As well as making the car look fairly stock, I also want to make the performance somewhat similar to what the full-scale car would be as well. Here I'm starting by cutting all the body panels from the parts tree and cleaning up the edge a bit with a hobby knife. I think the exterior of this body looks really good. The shape and proportions look correct, at least as far as I can tell, and the fitment of the bumpers and hood is decent. I started preparing this body for primer and paint by identifying and marking any mold lines that are visible with a permanent marker. These lines are caused by some of the plastic being squeezed between 2 pieces of the mold during manufacturing. These lines do not exist on the full-size car, so it will look best to sand these sections smooth. After marking all the mold lines, I use a bit of 380 grit sandpaper to remove them. In addition to the mold lines, I sanded a bit around any rough edges and any other imperfections I saw around the body. Here I'm securely taping the front bumper to the rest of the body. Once it is in position, I sand the surface between the 2 pieces so that the transition from the front bumper to the fenders is smooth. I continued to sand any sections that needed smoothing with the 380 grit sandpaper, such as where the part was attached to the parts tree. Here I'm test fitting the rear window. I'm not a huge fan of how the rear window is placed from the top of the body rather than from the inside like what is typical with most model kits I've built. However, it still looks good, and the rear spoiler will hide most of the spots where the window overlaps the body. After that, I sanded around the entire body with 600 grit sandpaper, which will help the primer to adhere to the plastic. The body is now ready to be washed and primed for paint. Though before I do any painting, I'm going to be test fitting all of the electronics and suspension components that I'll be using, and see what modifications, if any, need to be made to the body first. Although the sanding and prep work is a bit tedious, it plays a huge role in the overall outcome of the paint job. Next, I'm going to be turning my attention to the chassis and beginning to mock up the suspension components, motor mount, and electronics to figure out what modifications need to be made to the chassis piece. More on that in a future video. As always, I'm going to end this video by showing some of the amazing work that's been showcased over in the Make It RC Facebook group. Thank you all so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed today's video, and I'll see you next time.